We have a lot of issues to watch out for, whether it be regulatory, tax, personal income tax, or property tax, sales tax, all the different types of taxes that business owners pay. So we're watching all of that closely, as well as the tort reform pieces and the regulatory and employer mandates. All of the things that we've talked about today are really things that in the states we keep a very close eye on.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. Every 2 weeks, a new episode offers resources for small business owners and information on relevant laws and regulations. NFIB and our members advocate to keep U.S. small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
This is the Small Business Rundown. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President of Advocacy, and on today's show, we are talking about the states. We're going to talk about NFIB's legislative priorities in states nationwide. Joining me to discuss this is NFIB's Vice President of State Government Relations, Tim Goodrich, and Regional State Directors Don McVeigh and Nathan Humphrey. Guys, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
How does NFIB work with our members to determine their biggest issues and priorities?
Well, Adam, first of all, we survey our member with a ballot question every year in every state. As we've talked about many times in our podcasts, NFIB is one member, one vote. So no member gets more priority than another member. And so we do a ballot question every year in each state to find out where they stand on the issues.
Just like we do on the federal level. I think that's important. And a lot of times, Tim, there are actions by one state and other states take notice, or nationally, the federal government might take notice. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact that one state's actions might have on another or on policy on a federal level?
Yeah, sure. Right now there's 46 states that are in session out of 50. We have about 4 states that don't meet this year. So there's definitely a lot going on at the state level. And as some of the states learn about actions in one state, they may want to take up that same one. And I'm going to punt over to Nathan to talk a little bit about ADA compliance and what he's seeing in some of the states he manages.
Yeah, ADA is a perfect example of that. It sprung up in Missouri this year. It has been a really bad problem for a lot of small businesses that have been targeted by, and many times, a law firm that's from out of state. Mm-hmm. They target these small businesses because, they don't have in-house counsel. They're easy to leverage. It's basically a shakedown. They said, pay us this money and we'll go away. And they don't have the resources to fight it in court, and it would be more expensive. So they just end up writing the check. And these law firms, there's no cost to them. They never go to court. They don't even step into a courtroom. All it costs them is a stamp and an envelope, and they carpet bomb a large swath of businesses, and they then just wait for the checks to come in. So this has been a big problem. We're really concerned about this in Missouri. And while we've been working on that, it has popped up in Georgia now, where they are also looking at these bills too. So all these states talk to each other. They watch what other states are doing. They're in competition with each other in the market. So that's one of the first questions they ask is when a bill or issue comes up is, well, what does our neighboring state do? Where are we? And I don't know that also crosses into football rivalries as part of that, but if they pay attention to what their neighbors are doing.
Yeah. Adam, the reverse side of that is sometimes a state does something that's harmful to small business and other states pick up on it. I know Don has one in Colorado on OSHA.
Yeah, Colorado this year is actually considering creating their own state level OSHA, which we already know that our members tell us that the federal regulations are cumbersome and burdensome and compliance riddled as already. And so now Colorado is looking at a bill that would actually create their own state level with a whole new layer. So basically redundancy in the regulations in the name of worker safety, but at the same time, it's only going to create more opportunities for, business owners to be out of compliance, not on purpose, but, not knowing what these new regulations might entail. And then, of course, the opportunities for lawsuits will be abundant. So we're working very hard in Colorado right now to be sure the legislators understand just how bad this is and how unnecessary it is to have a duplicative new set of regulations on businesses, and hopefully try to kill it in the session that we're currently in.
Yeah, to expand on that a little bit, Nathan, you mentioned ADA compliance. That's Americans with Disability Act, or Don OSHA, and the regulations that businesses have to follow. For somebody that maybe doesn't own or work in a small business or doesn't understand how this works, and their question might be, why don't they just comply? What's the answer to that? Why is this such an issue?
Well, it's a lot of gotcha type lawsuits. So, one that people find hard to believe is websites. Making your website readable to someone who's blind or hard at seeing. There's no black and white standard that quantifies like, okay, you're compliant, you're not prejudiced towards certain people that have disabilities with that. Other times it's their actual business location, they're grandfathered in many times, but these law firms can pull it up on Google Maps and look and see, well, the curb of the sidewalk isn't where it should be, or the door handles aren't tall enough, guardrails aren't. It could be 100,000 different things. It's not one. And it's on you now to defend yourself. And it's very subjective. And again, there's not a clear rules that say like you have to do this specific way. It's kind of up to interpretation in many times.
I would just add to that, I live out here in rural Virginia, and we're just excited when a business remembers to put their hours when they're open and closed on their website, meaning they don't really have the experts in these small businesses all the time to keep their websites up to date. And if you've got some well-heeled lawyer in New York that's looking at your website, somebody in New York asks someone from rural Missouri to ship to them, and they're not compliant with New York law, that big law firm in Manhattan's going to go after the person there in Missouri.
Tim, you mentioned that there are 40, you said 46 states in session right now. Before we dive into what some of those states are working on, can we talk a little bit about last year and where we saw some successes, or maybe where there were some disappointments for small businesses that we may be working on in the next year?
Yeah, we had some good victories. I'll mention one, and I know Don and Nathan have a couple, but the one that I'll mention, in New York, we had a big win on beneficial ownership. Listeners may remember that the federal law had compliance with beneficial ownership. And Adam, I know you've covered this in several podcasts. New York had its own state law, and it was tied to the federal law. When we got relief from the Trump administration, there was a question of whether or not New York businesses were still going to have to comply with the same beneficial ownership system that was mirroring what the federal had established. And the legislature passed it, and we were very concerned about it. There were some penalties involved with it. Our members got very involved. We did an issue campaign, meaning we did digital ads, radio ads, requesting the governor to veto. Listeners may know that the governor in New York is not necessarily favorable to business, but she vetoed the bill, and it was a huge victory for New York members.
And what are some of the trends that we're seeing across the states right now?
We're seeing budgets are tightened. During COVID, there was a lot of COVID money that came in from DC to the states and locals, and some did the right thing. A lot of states took that money, invested in existing programs such as paying off unemployment insurance debt. Unfortunately, others didn't, and created new programs that they now cannot fund and need to find funding. So some of these states are looking at raising taxes to come up with the money that they used from the Fed. It was only a temporary measure, so now we're looking at some states that need to raise taxes. I would say another thing that's concerning on the environmental side, we haven't talked much about that today, but some of the AGs in less than friendly business states, the attorney generals are taking action against the federal government. Recently, the federal government just announced that the EPA may not consider climate change as something that the EPA can regulate. And so the AGs and some of the states are going to take issue with that. And Don and And Nathan may have some examples on that and some other issues.
Along the lines of taxes, yeah, coming out of COVID, it really kind of shifted things around. A lot of states, some of the red states, cut taxes significantly, have brought down the income tax. The local governments haven't, and we've seen local taxes go way up. So there's been a lot of efforts in a lot of states to try and address the local level property tax issue. We've also had Missouri and Georgia and South Carolina look at either eliminating or cutting significantly back on the income tax entirely. And, there's pros and cons on all these big tax bills. And one thing that we have to be careful about is shifting the burden from one area onto businesses. So, it's important. Like one of the sayings we say a lot is you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And it's important that we make sure small businesses at the table when these discussions are happening on taxes in particular.
I was just going to add to that because it's like Nathan said about what's going on in these states. You have to be at the table. You have to have your voice there. And, that is the great thing about our state program. We're in all 50 states and we're able to voice our members' position. But, one of the things that they're doing in Arizona, for example, Governor Hobbs just vetoed for the second time the tax conformity legislation that we were trying to pass there to conform the state tax code with the federal bill that we had such great success on last year. And so it was so frustrating to be going through that process. And for our members, we have members go to the press conference, go get involved and tell the governor, tell the legislature how important it was for them to have this certainty to kind of know what to expect and what they needed to file for their state taxes. And instead of following through with following the forms that her Department of Revenue put out, she decided to go ahead and just create total chaos there. So our small business owners across Arizona are probably going to be looking at refiling their taxes, their state taxes, additional taxes that will probably be due because they won't have the right forms. They won't have the right conformity with the federal code. So it's going to be a mess over there this year.
So Don mentioned Arizona, where they were trying to have their state tax code reflect what we're all familiar with, which is the small business deduction being made permanent last year in the federal tax bill, helping more than 33 million small businesses avoid a tax increase. And a lot of states want to have their state tax code mirror or somehow reflect what happened on a federal level. Arizona did not go that way. Are there other examples of how things are going since the passage of the tax bill last summer?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about it, Adam. Unfortunately, state tax codes can be more complicated in terms of how they interact with the federal taxes. So we can't always get it passed, but we've had some success, as Don said, we're working with Arizona. Michigan quickly adopted the small business deduction. They did not adopt, unfortunately, some of the other business deductions, but of course, for small businesses, that's the one that's the most important. So we were pleased with that. We've looked at Wisconsin. We're trying to get some movement there and some other ones. As far as taxes in general, though, we're seeing a lot of concern and activity on property taxes. Iowa in particular, we're seeing a lot of activity. Sometimes your friends, though, can't agree on a solution. And right now, at least as we're recording this in Iowa, we've got a House proposal, we've got a Senate proposal, and we've got a gubernatorial proposal. So unless we can get some agreement on it, we may fail to pass any kind of cuts there. But I know Nathan's got a few that are looking at some property tax cuts as well.
Yeah, it's a very similar story when the way you described it, Tim. In Florida, in Georgia, you've got one chamber that wants to get rid of the income tax entirely. And then the House wants to get rid of the property tax. And so you got to figure out how to make the math work. So we'll see what happens. But just like Iowa, it's very similar.
One of the things that we see a lot from both parties is proposals to expand sales tax to services, which our members really don't like. And this just, in Virginia, we have a new governor, a Democratic trifecta, and there were proposals all over the place to raise taxes, even though there's a $1.7 billion budget surplus. And one of the big proposals, I'm going to let Nathan talk about it, had to do with the sales tax on services.
Yeah, it was pretty aggressive and it touched everything from dog walker businesses to your Uber rides to your DoorDash food delivery and everything in between. So this would have caught majority of our members in that section. So thankfully, we've slowed that down. I think it's been tabled for the rest of this session, but Virginia is a big concern for us. There's a lot of issues on the table that directly impact our members.
We'll be right back to hear about labor and environmental issues.
Top credit card processing companies using anti-competitive practices have more than doubled swipe fees since 2012. With small businesses footing the bill for billions of dollars each year, Congress must take action to stop surging fees. You can help support this effort to add fair competition into the card processing market by sharing how credit card swipe fees affect your small business at nfib.com/swipe fees.
Welcome back. I know we've got a lot of labor issues in the states. We always do, whether it's paid leave, unemployment benefits for striking workers, like was mentioned earlier, the heat standards we'll probably talk about. So what are we seeing upcoming in the states with regards to labor?
Well, Adam, for example, Colorado's dealing with a OSHA, like we talked about their OSHA regulations earlier. That's on the table. They also are looking at what they call the Labor Peace Act, and Colorado has had a very fine balance of union and business friendliness, trying to everybody get along there for quite some time, and that's why they call it that. But last year and again this year, there's a push by the unions to strengthen their foothold and make it difficult for businesses to really have a voice in the process, because they're wanting to have more of a vote, basically. So it's a little bit of a complicated thing without getting into the weeds on the bill. But the bottom line is that the unions are looking for an opportunity to make it easier for them to walk into your business and sign people up. And so that's, obviously a concern for us. And so we're watching that very closely there in Colorado. And then on the winning side, we don't always like to talk about the bad news going on in some states. So we do have some positive things that are happening, and Nebraska is a great example. We actually just passed a minimum wage bill there that will curtail what was passed on the ballot initiative a few years ago. And basically it was a stair-step increase, and then after a certain point next year, the increase would be tied to CPIU, which in the past at one point had been 5.1%. And so this would be obviously tremendously detrimental to our small businesses. And so we got that capped at 1.75%. So that's done, as well as created a youth and training wage in the bill, so that young people coming in aren't just going right out the gate at this, $15 an hour.
I would add that independent contractor classification is one that always comes up. We're seeing it in New Jersey and Rhode Island and some other states. Basically what this is they try to reclassify an independent contractor as an employee. And you might be wondering, what's the significance of that? Why does that matter? Well, the unions want it because they want to put more people underneath a classification as an employee so that they can then unionize that labor force. Obviously, that drives costs up for consumers. And that can be anything from an independent sports writer in California to your own lawn cutter. So it's something that we're always fighting on a consistent basis.
When it comes to environmental policies, we touched on earlier some of the things from past sessions, but what do we see in the next year with regards to some of the one-size-fits-all mandates that we often see placed on small businesses?
Yeah, I think the big one is carbon reduction caps. We're seeing that in several states. I think, Nathan, even down south, you've had some environmental issues.
Yeah, what you probably know a little bit more about Reggie, Tim, that's up in Virginia. But I'll say we've been on part of coalitions to stop the ban of different types of energy sources. That's been prevalent in a lot of the states in the South, where we've put in protections that prevent local governments from banning certain sources of energy. And we've been successful in a lot of those states in doing that.
And let's talk tort. This is the issue that always seems to be top of mind for small businesses. We talked about ADA compliance a little bit ago, but there are several states that are giving small business owners heartburn when it comes to lawsuit abuse and other types of litigation. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, at least for the states that I cover, it really started in Florida. sometimes it's got to get worse before it gets better. And it just got to the point where it was so bad that the legislature and the governor came in and passed overwhelming, sweeping tort reform legislation in Florida. And then the billboard lawyers moved north into Georgia, and we saw a big increase in lawsuits and in the billions of dollars in some of these cases in Georgia. And it continues to move north. Thankfully, we were able to pass a great bill last year in Georgia that addressed a lot of that. We got bogged down in a fight in South Carolina to make some reforms there as well. And we're continuing to hopefully continue to push that in South Carolina this year. It's prevalent in Missouri. It's a fight that just never really ends. When we make reforms, they usually last for about 10 years, and then the trial lawyers come in and whittle that down, and we have to come back and try and fix it.
So Nathan was talking about some great reforms that had happened in Florida a couple years ago. And Louisiana actually took a cue from that and passed a major reform package last year as well, really aimed at getting insurance rates in check. And we hope to see some benefits of this in the coming years. Obviously, this stuff doesn't happen overnight when we change policy. So the work we're doing in the state capitals is so important for that piece of the equation. Now, in Arkansas and Utah, I like to call it the tale of two bills. Last year in Arkansas, we were finally able, for the first time in quite a while, to get some really good tort reform done. And it was really limiting what's called phantom damages. And so phantom damages are basically the full amount of the cost for some treatment or something associated with, an injury. And what happens is no one ever actually pays those costs, right? We all know that insurance steps in and pays a certain amount and that sort of thing. And so it's kind of the sticker price versus the actual paid price. And so in Arkansas, we were able to get that passed to where we're limiting the ability for juries to consider this extra expense. So great passage, great win. The opposite is happening right now in Utah. And it's really frustrating because Utah is always known as such a pro-business state, great place to do, whether it be small business, big business, they just always have a great ranking, and even their tort climate has always been good. This year, however, we've got a bad bill going and we're hoping to stop it. And so it's basically doing the opposite of what we were able to accomplish in Arkansas. And so it's really going to limit what a jury knows about what's paid on a claim and what costs go into it, instead trying to get the juries to award these very large awards and verdicts that come down that really ultimately the impact of that on a small business owner is going to be an increase in their business liability insurance, potentially their auto insurance. So we're seeing what basically refer to it as the tort tax. And so we're seeing what this plays out to be in states across the country. And whenever you have a bad tort climate, we can see that people are paying more in insurance costs. And so we really want to keep a close eye on that and rein that in to the extent that we can.
Tim or Nathan, can one of y'all tell me a little bit about third-party litigation?
Yeah, third-party finance litigation is an issue that really shows just how much money is involved in this. This is where even private equity firms and even money from, believe it or not, China and other countries are coming in. They have actuarials that can go and look at a case and determine what the value of that is. And so they will finance some of these lawsuits to get them going. And it's an abuse to the victim too, because they'll say, we'll finance your litigation and then give you 40%, we'll take 60% of the judgment. But there's a lot of money in play in this and an abuse. So it's a fight we've had some success in West Virginia and a couple other states. It's Georgia. We're still fighting that in Florida and Missouri, but it's a big concern.
It's also an issue where we see overlap between state and federal issues. I know that there's a bill that we're supporting in Congress that would push back on this third-party financing of litigation. But there are a number of issues like that where it might be an issue in the states that sort of takes off and becomes of concern on a federal level, or the other way around. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those issues that straddle between being a federal issue or a state issue or both?
Yeah, I would start with heat standards. We've seen this, I think it really kind of started in Texas. We were involved in a lawsuit and several sessions down there. City of Austin wanted to implement heat standards. And now we're seeing this in some other states. Illinois has taken up the heat standards, but they also have a cold standard. When we say heat standards, we're talking about anything in Chicago would be under 30 degrees. Now, if you ever watch the Chicago Bears on TV in December, you know people can work under 30 degrees in Chicago, maybe not so much in Tallahassee. And then heat standards over 80 degrees.
So if it drops below 30 in Illinois or over 80 in the South, what's the real life implication for employees or the small business owner?
So we'll just take the obvious of construction. Let's say they're out doing road work or putting up a building. That means you have to have more breaks. You have to have abundancy of water. You might have to have portable heaters, all kinds of things to provide for perceived issues of the heat or the cold. Employers have to provide reasonable accommodations, and that's been defined by the Department of Labor and in the courts. And Adam, I believe there's a federal bill now that deals with the same issue.
Yeah.
You know, a couple other ones I'll mention, credit card swipe fees. I mean, talk to a small business owner that isn't frustrated with the cost of the 2 to 3% fee that they have to pay. We've heard from some members that the credit card fees are right up there with the cost of labor. And in some cases, we've heard that it's higher than the cost of labor. So we're trying to deal with this at the state level by trying to ensure that those swipe fees aren't taxed by the sales tax, which a lot of states do. And we're getting resistance from Visa and the banks on this. And then I know there's some federal legislation to deal with that as well. And then the final one I'll mention is paid leave. We've had a number of states mandate various kinds of paid leave. It could be medical leave for yourself. It could be your family. Sometimes family gets defined as your cat or your dog. And the leave can be anywhere from 3 days to, we had one in Michigan where you could be off for 3 days before you had to tell your employer. In other words, you could not show up for 3 days and then tell your employer you were on paid leave. Kind of ridiculous to say the least. But, you know, the other night I was talking to a legislator from Michigan about their law. This legislator was from a rural part of Michigan. And he was telling me that the hospital in his community has had problems treating patients in the ER because they've had nurses and others that have all been on paid leave at the same time. So, you know, this isn't just a small business issue. This is really a health concern. And I guess most recently, some congressmen up on the Hill are looking at federal legislation to see if they can set some federal standard that would take some of the craziness out of this at the state level.
So definitely flowing both ways. Well, this has been a really good discussion. Before we go for the day, is there anything else any of the three you'd like to add?
Yeah, Adam, we're really proud of the work we're doing in the states. We have a lot of issues to watch out for, whether it be regulatory, tax, personal income tax or property tax, sales tax, all the different types of taxes that business owners pay. So we're watching all of that closely, as well as the tort reform pieces and the regulatory and employer mandates. All of the things that we've talked about today are really things that in the states we keep a very close eye on. And we're really proud of the work that we're doing for our small business owner members and the small business owners across our country.
Yeah, Adam, I'll just point out, as I mentioned, Virginia, where there's a lot of hot issues that we are working on. One of them is a right to work. It's a protection that actually Virginia is the most northern state that has this protection in the law that prevents an employee from being forced to be in a union as a condition of employment. And that is definitely on the line in Virginia, and NFIB is working to make sure that we can defend that law and putting all of our resources on the line to back our members up. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I would just add that, as we mentioned earlier, 46 of 50 states are going to be in session between now and June. And unlike Congress, things move very quickly at the state level. So really encourage NFIB members, small business owners to be vigilant and to be active. We've already seen this in Virginia just in the first few weeks. As we record this, we're in early February, and we've already killed a bill having to do with sales tax on services. So that's a good example of our members being active and vigilant. here as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing it up. And thank you all for this discussion. It's been a really good one. Appreciate you joining us today and looking forward to seeing how the 26 legislative sessions pan out.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Adam, for having us. Really enjoyed it.
For those who are interested, there are links in today's show notes on the federal issues that we discussed, or for those who want to take action and share their stories on how the small business deduction benefits their small business.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Small Business Rundown. Your continued support helps us amplify the issues that matter most. If you liked this episode, please help small business owners find the podcast by giving it a rating, like, or review. You can find us at nfib.com and on YouTube, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook.